Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Regents Annual Public Forum. My name's Porter Wilkinson. I'm the Chief of Staff to the Regents, and I'm going to take us through a couple housekeeping items before we turn it over to our panel. This event is being recorded and webcast live on the Smithsonian website, www.si.edu/regents/webcast. An American Sign Language interpreter will be on the screen for the duration of the event. Closed captioning will also automatically appear. If you'd like to turn it off at any time, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen. The board also welcomes your comments and your questions, and there's a button also on your screen to submit questions live during the show. I'd now like to introduce you to the Secretary of the Smithsonian and the members of the Board of Regents Executive Committee. First, we have Lonnie G. Bunch III, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian and the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Good afternoon.
Next, we have Dr. Risa Levizo-Morey, who is the chair of the Smithsonian Board of Regents. She's the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Population Health and Health Equity Professor Emerita at the University of Pennsylvania, and she is the longtime president and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Next, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Barbara Barrett, Vice Chair of the Board of Regents, who is the 25th Secretary of the Air Force and the former ambassador to Finland.
Thank you.
Finally, we have Frank Raines, who is the third member of the Executive Committee. He's the executive chairman and co-founder of the digital services company Zap Media and former director of the Office of Management and Budget. Now I will turn it over to Chair Dr. Risa Levizo-Morey to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Porter. On behalf of the entire Board of Regents, I want to welcome you to our annual public forum. We're excited to have all of you joining us in person and virtually. And the program today is going to focus on matters at the Smithsonian, including our new museums, America 250 celebration, collection space planning, and artificial intelligence. Before we turn to our roundtable discussion, I'd like to provide a brief update on the board, specifically some of the changes in membership that have occurred since the last public forum. As you may be aware, the Board of Regents has 17 members. 2 members, the Vice President and the Chief Justice, serve as a duty of their office. 6 congressional regents are selected by congressional leadership, and 9 citizen regents are nominated by the Board of Regents and appointed by a joint resolution of Congress and signed by the President. According to the Smithsonian Charter, 2 citizen regents must reside in Washington, D.C., and the others must come from any state, but no 2 regents can come from the same state. In 2023, we had several transitions. 2 of our congressional regents, Senator Patrick Leahy and Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard, did not seek re-election, and because their terms on the board must coincide with their terms in Congress, their terms as regents ended in January of 2023. Senator Gary Peters was appointed to the Board of Regents in January. Senator Peters is of the state of Michigan and has been in the Senate since 2015. Representative Garrett Graves was also appointed to the Board of Regents in January, and Congressman Graves represents nearly 800,000 people across southern Louisiana. Additionally, we said goodbye to a citizen regent and former chair of the Board of Regents, Steve Case, who ended his second 6-year term in April. We're very fortunate last month to have welcomed our newest regent, Toni Bush. She was the executive vice president and global head of government affairs at News Corp, a global media company that comprises the Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post. We are very fortunate to have her as part of the Board of Regents. That concludes my updates from the Board of Regents, and now we'll kick off our forum with a discussion of key matters to the Smithsonian. And I'd like to hand it back to Porter to lead this part of the discussion.
Thanks, Risa. In December of 2020, Congress passed legislation authorizing the establishment of 2 new museums to join the Smithsonian collection: the National Museum of the American Latino and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. Risa, would you please tell us what the status of those museums is?
Absolutely. Well, after the founding legislation was passed, the Secretary and his leadership team, along with the Regents, began to work on all aspects of the planning, including the museum, the board leadership, and site selection. In 2021, the Regents appointed the required members of the advisory groups, including Regent representatives, to the Board of Trustees of both museums. These boards, as well as the museum's advisory boards, are instrumental in ensuring that the success of the museums and also provide insight into how we will continue to get invaluable information and recommendations on location, planning, design, and construction of the respective museums. And now I'd like to turn it over to Barbara and Frank to give their perspectives as members of those boards.
Well, I serve as the representative of the Board of Regents on the Smithsonian American Women's Advisory Council, putting together the ideas of how will such a museum to represent that 50% plus of the American population, how will that museum go forward? The ideas behind it that the council are working on include building a better understanding of our past and inspiring our future. It is important to the council that the museum site be on the Mall as an important symbol of the position of women in America's democracy. So there's a star-studded, very hardworking and distinguished council that is building the ideas that will then lead to fundraising and site selection and eventually a museum that will be constructed on the Mall to represent women.
Well, it's been almost 20 years since I became one of the inaugural members of the Advisory Council for the museum in which we sit right now, and I'm very proud to be the Regent representative on the American Latino Museum Board of Trustees. This board has taken on a major responsibility to produce a museum that we can all be proud of, and is taking its work very seriously. There's nothing more important, though, in the creation of an institution like this than to know what the site is going to be. You can't begin to program. It's more difficult to fundraise. It is a hindrance to getting the enthusiasm that you need to create a new institution in Washington. Having this museum on the Mall is a major priority of the Board of Trustees, and I would dare say for the Latino community at large. So I'm very happy to be a part of the solution here. As Lonnie knows, it's rare that you participate in the creation of one Smithsonian museum. Having the chance to participate in the creation of 2 is a real delight.
There really isn't anything as important that we're going to do than building these 2 museums. They are crucially important to both how we as Americans understand ourselves. They're crucially important in terms of how the Smithsonian reaches new audiences. And they're crucially important because the time has come. It's now the right time to do this. And the challenge for us is making sure these museums are on the National Mall. What we did is for almost a year, we analyzed a variety of sites off the Mall, on the Mall, and came to the decision that the most optimal sites are 2 sites on the Mall. One is called the sort of site that is on 15th Street and Independence, which is really called the South Mall site, which is really the spot that we are positing for the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. And then there is another site that we tend to call the Tidal Basin site, that is really the site that we plan for the National Museum of the American Latino. Now, what's important is site selection is crucial, and it's not done willy-nilly. It's done by looking at everything from population density, issues of environmental considerations, safety, and it really led us that these are the best sites that not only allow us to build signature museums, but also allow us to signal to the world how important it is that these museums are both on the National Mall. We also realize, though, that we can't wait to tell those stories. So we've really worked hard to think about how do you virtually explore these stories? How do you make sure that the stories of women are really tapped throughout the Smithsonian? And how do we use technology to do that? And the same thing with the Latino Museum, to make sure that we have spaces that allow people to test ideas, tell stories. In essence, this history is too important that it can't wait for a building, but the building will make it real and concrete.
Thank you. I'd like to pivot now to another milestone that's coming up. In 2026, America will celebrate the 250th anniversary of its founding. And the Smithsonian seems like it could have a major role in this celebration. Could you tell us a little bit about what your plans are for that celebration?
The 250th celebration of the Declaration of Independence is really one of the most important moments, because it's a moment where a country can come together and find understanding, hope, understand its history better. And at a time when there's real divisions in this country, it's important for the Smithsonian to be part of the glue that holds the country together. And so what we want to do is use the 250th as a two-sided coin. One side is to actually use this moment to help the Smithsonian grapple with the challenge of technology, to think about AI and how do we use that, but also to help the Smithsonian recognize that it has to serve audiences not just who can come to Washington, but all over the country. And then the other side is to say, how do you craft a process that allows people to sort of see America as a place to celebrate and to see and understand how America has evolved, trying to live up to those stated ideals. So part of what we're trying to do is to recognize that in order to celebrate the 250th, we've got to make sure we're outside of Washington. So we're really looking at creating regional collaborations that allow the Smithsonian to work with partners, work with educators, work with cultural institutions, work with other museums around the country to basically tell the story from a variety of lenses, to tell the story based on the expertise and the collections of the Smithsonian, but to have those stories made richer by local stories, by local communities. And so in essence, the goal is to really say, we are a collaborator rather than we are the engine. And so therefore, by collaborating, we'll be able to sort of develop new partnerships. We'll be able to make sure that we do something that's crucially important to me, which is that the Smithsonian has to touch every home and be in every classroom. And we want to use the 250th to get us there. It also means using the 250th to think about technology. We want to think about things like creating an app that says, ask the Smithsonian everything you want to know about the era of the American Revolution. We want to be able to tap the wonders of the Smithsonian and make it accessible for the public. The goal is simple, is to say that this is a moment of great celebration, a moment of great understanding. And the Smithsonian, as a place that is trusted, is really a place where people can come together, whether it's coming to Washington or through these local partnerships, and learn the history and learn how that history continues to shape who we are today.
Thank you. Barbara, as a former ambassador, former Secretary of the Air Force, you're well-versed in patriotism. How do you view the Smithsonian's role in helping Americans celebrate and reflect on what unites us?
Well, I think Secretary Bunch said it very well. He covered it so very well. But let me just add some thoughts. This is a real opportunity. It's a golden opportunity for us to celebrate the spirit of America. This is a time for us to look back at our history and to pull together for our future. It's a time, the Smithsonian is already known for its top assets with regard to technology and transportation, with engineering and other elements of our society. But with the 250th anniversary, whether you call it the semi-quincentennial or you call it the sesquicentennial, in 2026, we will celebrate the founding of our great nation, a nation that will always be looking to get better. And what we will hope is that we can be an instrument of that getting better. We have tools to do that. from the microscope to the telescope, from studying DNA of zoo animals and of species that we are the repository of the type specimen for, to our telescope capabilities that are reaching to better understanding of the universe in which this great nation and all of the earth is confined. This Smithsonian has access to great capabilities, and therefore we can be a perfect place to be celebrating the spirit of America. And with that collaboration, with innovation, and with the employment of the assets and the teamwork that the Smithsonian characterizes, this is really an opportunity for the Smithsonian to shine. So 2026, it's a great year for the Smithsonian, and it's a great year for America. Let's celebrate that 250th anniversary.
Thank you.
Well said.
Speaking of the Smithsonian's assets, the Board of Regents has spent a lot of time this year talking about collection storage and space planning. And the Regents as a group have visited two of the Smithsonian's main collection facilities out in Chantilly, Virginia, and Suitland, Maryland. Risa, would you mind talking about why that topic is so important to the board and why you took such an interest in those facilities?
Absolutely. First of all, I think everyone who's visited any part of the Smithsonian knows that our collection is staggering. We have, you pick your favorite artifact, whether it's a fossil from 3.5 billion years ago, it's the ruby slippers, it's the Apollo lunar landing craft, whatever it is, we have the memorabilia and the history of our nation, and that represents over 150 million objects, which we have the responsibility of stewarding on behalf of scientists, researchers, and the public so that they can have access to this vast collection. It's really our nation's shared history, and so as such, we take it very, very seriously. Now, the management of such a large collection requires both a strategic and a pragmatic approach so that we can make sure that the objects they're developed, they're kept over the long term, that we have plans for funding them, for prioritizing how they will be managed, and how we'll meet the challenges of managing those assets. Now, the space considerations are not trivial. They have to be secure, they have to be precisely managed from an environmental perspective, they have to be designed to ensure that we have access both for the public and for those who want to use them for research purposes. Now, we know that whatever we do, we can't stop collecting because our present will be our history in the future, and yet we have to be very thoughtful about what we add to our collections, particularly at this point in time. So it's in some ways a daunting task to think about how to manage and be stewards of this really global treasure.
Well, in many ways, when I think about the Smithsonian, I do think of the wonders of the collection. I think of when I first became a curator of political history many, many years ago, and I opened a drawer, and I found this little box that was 4-inch squared, and I opened it, and it was a compass, and I didn't know what it was, and we looked it up, and it was the compass that Lewis and Clark carried when they went across the country. So I learned early on as a curator, the key to being a good curator is don't drop anything, right? But I think that what it really reminded me of is just the amazing treasures that are in the Smithsonian. Whether it's we use those treasures to help people see the aspirational nature of the 250th anniversary, whether we use those treasures to give the public an opportunity to sort of understand and engage through an object. Because there's something powerful about an object, is that you see people time and time again walking into an exhibition and they'll look at an object, and then people who don't know each other will begin to talk to each other about the object. And it'll realize that this opens up communications in ways that books don't. And so for me, first of all, the collections are the heart of the Smithsonian. But then the question is, how do you preserve and how do you continue to build? Because as Risa said, the challenge is always to recognize that you have to collect today for tomorrow. And there's going to be more scientific material that you're going to need. So the collections are going to always grow. So it really means that you've got sort of three challenges. One is, how do you protect and preserve what you already have? How do you build storage units that are state-of-the-art, that allows you to make sure Lewis and Clark's compass or Abraham Lincoln's hat can be seen 300 years from now? But then the other challenge is, how do you realize that you've got to build more because you're always going to collect? And what does that mean? But then the third piece is really, how do you think about sharing those collections beyond the Smithsonian in a way that allows you to address some of the storage needs, but also address the opportunity that the fact that the Smithsonian can only show 5 to 6% of its holdings, and that you want people to be amazed and marvel and wonder in those collections, whether they be scientific or historical or artistic. So it really is a challenge to find all of that. And it really means that you're never going to be able to, candidly, build enough buildings to hold all the collections. So you've got to think about new ways of maybe sharing the collections, making sure that other cultural institutions, other people have long-term relationships with the Smithsonian so they can keep material for years. I was always struck, living in California, how NASA lent material from the space agency to museums for decades. And it both allowed the public to engage with these artifacts, but it also allowed NASA to have less problems with storage. So I think that the challenge for us is to recognize that you could build 20 more buildings to house what we're going to collect in the future. So the key is, what are the buildings that need to be built? How do you make sure they're the most effective they can be? And how do you find new ways to share those collections so that, in essence, you're really fulfilling a need to share and a need to be able to preserve?
Thank you. That's a great transition. And the Smithsonian is undoubtedly best known for its collections. But the Regents have spent a lot of time talking this year about a digital transformation, taking some of its assets in the virtual world and outside of the Beltway. Frank is a member of the Regents Strategy, Innovation, and Technology Committee, and is going to talk to us a little bit about artificial intelligence, which is getting to be almost mainstream, and also presents a lot of questions, both challenges and opportunities for cultural institutions and museums. And how do you think that the Smithsonian should, if at all, integrate artificial intelligence? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see?
Well, challenge and opportunities is a good way to think about it, because the opportunities we're already realizing. We sometimes think of AI as something that got invented last year when the generative AI became a viral topic of discussion. But every time you fill out a form and it suggests what the next word should be, that's artificial intelligence that is suggesting that you click on that word and not have to type it. Artificial intelligence is helping our telescopes to take vast amounts of information that is very faint, and from those pull them together into images that we can see as being distant stars or distant solar systems. So we're using artificial intelligence already today. The question that's come up is artificial intelligence has become so powerful now that moving beyond just suggestions, it is now trying to approach the human ability to create, to generate exposition or new knowledge. And that has become a challenge for a lot of people as to, well, what does that mean? How it affects an institution like the Smithsonian is particularly interesting. Let me just give you 3 examples of how it intersects with the Smithsonian. I mean, one, the Smithsonian is viewed as a trusted source. It stands behind the work that it presents, the exhibitions that are put on, the science that's created. But with artificial intelligence, you don't know what the real source of the answer is. And in fact, there's something called hallucinations where the systems actually just make stuff up. Well, if you're the Smithsonian, you can't live with that. That's not tolerable. And so you have to find how can you help to make at least some forms of AI more like the trusted source that the Smithsonian represents. Second, it can help you become more nimble. You can do things faster with it. You can get a first draft of something, and so that the writers become more editors than writers. You can check to see if how you've explained something in one place is it consistent in other places. And so that's a very valuable tool that's available. But again, you have to look for authenticity. And that nimbleness can't simply become a way of skipping steps that would lead to accuracy. And finally, the third example I would give is the visitor experience. Artificial intelligence can transform that experience from looking at an object that's simply stable and that you can't really approach because of the enclosure, and all of a sudden you can manipulate it and turn it around and make it do things so that you can understand it better. So it can enhance the visitor experience dramatically. So this is one of the challenges that I think it's not going to be resolved next week. It's not going to be resolved next year. But over the next 10 years, we're going to see lots of institutions struggling with how to get the benefits of artificial intelligence without the downsides. And I think the Smithsonian is very well positioned to be a leader.
I mean, in some ways, the Smithsonian has always been future-oriented. When you think about Joseph Henry thinking about creating what became the National Weather Service, when you think about the Smithsonian supporting the work that led to the telegraph, or the early work on aviation that led the Wright brothers to be successful. So in some ways, the Smithsonian has a history of embracing the future. And I think that we will continue to do that. I think the issues you raise are fundamental challenges. But I think the notion of recognizing that for the Smithsonian, the trusted brand, the trusted source is so essential that we'll jump into this lake, but maybe one toe at a time, just to make sure that we can do this right. And I think the other piece for me, though, is that it is the great opportunity to make connections that you don't normally see. I've been struck how already we're using AI to help us think about, there are all these stories we hear of inventiveness or leadership, and they traditionally were seen as being done by men. And now we're using AI to look at language, to look at shading, to look at tone, and suddenly we see women playing these roles that we hadn't seen, that AI allows us to do that. And I think the other piece that you framed it as so important is we're bombarded with so much information that AI is going to allow us to get our arms around it. So I do think it is really the future. I just think that maybe the future isn't now, but maybe it is next week.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to some questions from the audience, and a reminder that if you're online, you can use the Q&A function to submit a question as we sit here. The first question, I'll turn to you, Lonnie. It was a sad moment for the entire Washington community.
I know where you're going.
When the pandas were sent back to Washington. Can you tell us whether the Smithsonian is going to have pandas again in the future?
One of the great strengths of the Smithsonian is working collaboratively with people to say, this is an important issue. I feel very comfortable that the pandas will be back. I can't tell you when, but I can be sure they will be back. And already, candidly, with conversations that have happened with the State Department and the administration, even the Chinese premier has mentioned that how important it would be to have pandas back in the United States. So my sense is there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of negotiation still to be there. But I think that ultimately we want to make sure we have pandas back, because I've argued that the only way you fail as a secretary of the Smithsonian is if you lose the pandas forever.
We don't want you to fail.
I don't want to
The Washington Post has written a couple articles this year about the presence of human remains in the Smithsonian's collection. Can you talk a little about the ethical and humanitarian issues raised about these remains, and also your plans, if any, for returning them?
The issue of human remains is really crucially important to the Smithsonian, well before there were any newspaper coverage about it. But the reality is that the Smithsonian has thousands of human remains, and my belief is that the Smithsonian has to grapple with that legacy, because that's a legacy that many cultural institutions, educational institutions, museums have for collecting in the early 20th century, really basically saying, how do we collect human remains to explore issues of race, to explore issues of hierarchy of race? So these were collected often without any consent. So what we did was immediately put together a group of experts, both local, within the Smithsonian, and external experts, to help us think about what should we do with the issue of human remains. And several things have been made clear. We have received the report, we're really wrestling with it now, but I think first and foremost, what we want to make clear is that these are humans, not specimens, and they need to be treated with respect and honor. And so part of what we want to do is recognize that remains that we have that we don't have consent for need to be returned, whether they need to be returned to families, returned to communities, returned more broadly to cities. We're looking at how do you do that. But in essence, the goal here is to rethink that anything that we do not have consent for, we should return. But also, it really is important to think about, since the Smithsonian collected this material, how do we help families? How do we help families make sure they can find loved ones? How do we help them inter them with respect? So what we're doing is working both within the Smithsonian and working with other partners, looking at other universities, how they're doing that, looking at other museums, and really say that the Smithsonian has to be a leader in ethical consideration, especially human remains. And so I think that I feel very comfortable that we have a process that will both allow us to return human remains, but will also allow us to think much more strategically and humanely about human remains research at the Smithsonian. I think any scholar will tell you, like a scholar of African American history will tell you, that there have been aspects of African American history that we've learned so much from human remains. But I think the notion ought to be that human remain research ought to be regulated, be very carefully done, and it should be limited in scope and limited in time. The notion of keeping human remains for 50 years in a box is abhorrent to me. And that I really want to make sure that the Smithsonian does the kind of research and science that is absolutely necessary, but that recognizes that this is a new day. And the day is, how do we make sure that ethically we treat human remains in the way they deserve to be? And I think it raises the fundamental question down the road is, what's the role of human remains anyway at the Smithsonian? And I think we're looking at all of that now and beginning to ask fundamental questions, hard questions. But in essence, I keep saying the key is, without consent, one must be returned. And two, treat these remains with the dignity they deserve, rather than just being specimens. So I think those are guiding as we're going to go forward. I think this is going to be, you cannot solve this problem overnight, but I think we're moving in the right direction, and I feel very comfortable that the Smithsonian will be seen as a leader when it comes to dealing with human remains.
Let me just make one other comment that I've heard you mention many times, Mr. Secretary, and that is your commitment, as you said, to be transparent, but also to act with urgency in making sure that these human remains are returned, and returned as quickly as we possibly can. And I think it's important for the communities affected to understand that commitment as well.
I think it's so important to, one, make sure we have the right processes and structures in place, but that I want people to move with urgency. And I want people to recognize that the Smithsonian cares about what this means for your family, for your community. And we want to work collaboratively with you to sort of make sure that everybody is honored and respected, and that the Smithsonian is seen as a place that maybe made some mistakes in the way we collected this material, but we no longer do that. And we're really going to set the standard of what a museum, what a cultural institution, what an educational institution like the Smithsonian should do when it comes to human remains. So there is great urgency.
Thank you. We've gotten a couple questions about the timeline for the new museums, and specifically whether you think Congress will approve the sites this year, and when design and construction will begin.
Well, as Frank said earlier, the selection of a site is so crucial to any new museum. It is crucial in terms of it gives you an idea of what the footprint is, so therefore what could be the content within the museum. It also gives you an understanding of what kind of structure you can create, how architecturally significant can you be. And it also is really one of those symbols that people look for to say, this is really going to happen. And so I think it's crucially important for us to get this site selection. We have hope that we've got a lot of people working in that direction, and we hope to be able to sort of see some real decisions within this calendar year. My hope is that we will know how we move forward. Our commitment as the Smithsonian is these museums are worthy of the mall, they're essential to the mall, and we want to do everything we can to make that happen. Then it seems to me the reality is that to actually build a museum is really a decade-long process in terms of being able to think both about what structure looks like, what's the program, but also building the collections, building the staff, and most importantly, raising the money. And so that's going to take an extended period of time. When we built the National Museum of African American History and Culture, it was 11 years from the time I started as director till the time we cut the ribbon. I think now we can maybe move a little quicker with new technologies and the like, but the key is to get that site and to move forward. I think the other thing we're doing is recognizing that even in best case scenario, if it's a decade long, we just can't wait. So that's why we're very much trying to tell stories virtually, trying to make sure other museums of the Smithsonian are telling different stories so that we can make sure that the public doesn't have to wait a decade to be made better by the richness of these stories.
And how do you see the new museums affecting the holdings, focus, and programming of existing museums?
Let me take the example of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was really clear to me that that museum should stimulate collections of African American history in other parts of the Smithsonian, that it should not be the only place that tells those stories. And I would argue that what you're really making the argument for, whether it's the American Women's History Museum or whether it's the National Museum of American Latino, what you're doing is saying it's a two-sided coin. One side is the opportunity to delve deeply into Latino culture or women's history, so that you tell that from an insider's perspective. But then the other side is to say these are stories that are more than just stories for a single community, that these are stories that profoundly shape us all as Americans, as citizens. So really to be able to make sure that we see this in a way that what that does, in the best case scenario, the National Museum of African American History and Culture challenge other parts of the Smithsonian to explore many of these questions. So as long as you're doing something that is crucially important, collaborating and communicating, you're able to ensure that these stories then are made better by being touched at all parts of the Smithsonian. But what's essential is you need a beacon. You need a place where that draws people to a particular story, a particular culture, and then that beacon should spread out both throughout the Smithsonian and also around the country. So I see it as an opportunity to enrich the Smithsonian regardless of the museum, but it's also an opportunity to create these beacons that can be transformative globally.
Thank you.
Great.
The Arts and Industries Building. The Smithsonian owns that site, so are there any plans for that building?
The Arts and Industries Building is my second favorite building on the National Mall. And in some ways, I think it is really one of the treasures. It was the first building built in 1881 for it to be a museum. I think that there have been a lot of discussions over the years of how to use the Arts and Industries Building. It's a building that needs a lot of work. It's a building that needs to be transformed if there's any opportunity for it to become a museum. So I think that what we're looking for is recognizing that that building is too important just to stand fallow on the mall. So we're looking at a variety of opportunities to rethink that building. And so my hope would be that over the next few years, there would at least be an understanding of what that building can be, because it's too important just to be left alone. It is really both a wonderful monument of what museums once were, but it's also this amazing signal of the Smithsonian saying in 1881, we want to be the cutting edge museum. So how do we make it a cutting edge building moving forward is something we're wrestling with.
Thank you. Before we close, I want to ask a forward-looking question. And for each of you, what do you think is something that should be top of mind for the Smithsonian in 2024?
Well, I'll start. I think, the Smithsonian, as we've mentioned several times today, has always been a trusted institution and one that people look to for accurate information that can help them advance in their communities, in their science, in their culture, art, and so on. And I think what we're learning is it's really important for the Smithsonian to reach out to all parts of the country in order to continue to build that trust. And we're doing that. We're hope to do it even more, both virtually like this, and also the old-fashioned way, in person with boots on the ground. But I think for us going forward, building that trust in ways that can bring in the voices from people around the country is one of our top priorities.
Well, I think the effort to have a digital transformation at the Smithsonian will be a real lever for change. And once the momentum gets going there, I think it will become unstoppable. But there's so many opportunities in new technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but in the overall transition to a digital world that I think we'll be amazed how quickly this has an impact. I mean, I'll give you just one example. The mere digitization of exhibitions by the Smithsonian and making it available through its own website or through open access is going to encourage lots of other people to then begin to build things on top of, around, and underneath this content that the Smithsonian is providing. And that means you're not just going to have the Smithsonian employees thinking about these issues, but you're going to have thousands and thousands of developers coming up with new ideas, teachers and professors and others utilizing these digital assets as part of their daily work, particularly in education. So I think the getting momentum going on that digital transition will be remarked upon in years to come as being a real turning point in the Smithsonian, and where it is not just simply known as a owner of museums, but becomes this trusted source to information that people rely on, much in the same way that they rely on Professor Google now to resolve all disputes. In its own area, I think the Smithsonian will be able to become that reliable source through the use of technology.
Well, I can't argue with either trusted source or the digital future. So allow me to add to those two, because I believe in both of those. But let me add that the Smithsonian of the future ought to be an asset that isn't geographically confined. We have significant operations in Boston. We have museums in New York City. Our biggest presence, recognized presence, is here in Washington. But we reach beyond those geographies through things like the channel and the magazine and podcasts and our digital presence today. But I think it is really important to take advantage of things like sites, the Smithsonian Institution's traveling exhibition services, and others to engage the Smithsonian in the lives of people across the country and to some extent around the world. Certainly that's being done by our science. From the tops of Mount Whitney and Mount Hopkins to the depths of the deep reef in Curacao, we are doing research from the highs to the lows and around the world. But we also need to bring closer to the classrooms, the information that we have and help young people's eyes light up with the understanding that there's something really fascinating about whether it's an insect or an atmosphere, something very exciting for young people. And the Smithsonian has access to all of that, and opening that to greater eyes would be a vision I would have for the future as a trusted source and as a digital presence, a continuation of our access to everyone around the country and around the globe.
In many ways, Barbara, I agree with you so much. I really think that this year, the next couple of years, it's about how do you reintroduce the Smithsonian to the American public. There are many people that know the name, but as we hear from my educators, there's real opportunities to engage and to be made better by that relationship. I think I want to consciously say, how do we recognize that we've got a great audience, but the audience could be 3 or 4 times bigger? How do we make sure that, as I've said earlier, that we really are in every home and touch every classroom? How do we utilize, as you framed it, all of our assets? We've got traditional assets, we've got non-traditional assets, we've got amazing scholars. How do we use all those assets so people realize that the Smithsonian is one of the most amazing gifts to the nation? It's a gift of education, it's a gift of memory, it's a gift of opportunity, it's a gift of understanding, it's a gift of hope. And in many ways, I believe strongly that if we could use the next few years to say, this is why the Smithsonian matters to you, this is how the Smithsonian touches you, wherever you are, it'll make sure that the next centuries are the century of the Smithsonian, not the century of what the Smithsonian once was, but a century of the Smithsonian as a place that matters, that people see as a reservoir that dip into every day to find more about themselves or about the questions of science, that they really want. I want the Smithsonian to be a place that you care about every day, not just on an 8th grade field trip.
You know, if I may add just one more, I think people don't realize that the black-footed ferret is coming back from 24 individuals, almost an extinct species, and through the works of the zoo, the National Zoo, an asset of the Smithsonian, the black-footed ferret is now being reintroduced to its original habitat. When we see the cheetah research, the Brzezowski's horse, the crowned cranes, that the Smithsonian is preserving species. So I guess I'd amend my comment that it's beyond the humans of our society, but it's on to species beyond the human species, that the Smithsonian carries an importance that often may not be recognized.
And I think the other challenge is I really want to peel back the veil so people understand who does the work of the Smithsonian. When you think about the work of conservation that you talk to, there are many young women scientists that are really leading, doing amazing research in Montana and Front Royal, Virginia. So in some ways, I think part of the goal ought to be for let people see beyond the veil. The museums are places that like to sort of keep things secret. They like special knocks and secret handshakes. I want us to open the veil so people can see the amazing people who are doing great work and see the commitment of the educators, of the scholars. So I think all of this is part of my commitment to say, let us reintroduce the Smithsonian so it is that reservoir in your home that you can dip into.
I can't imagine that there aren't some young people out there listening right now who one day may be a curator at the Smithsonian or more.
They can have my job.
Not too soon.
Not too soon.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, we'll answer it via email. And in the meantime, if you're looking for more great Smithsonian content, I hope that you'll look up our Side Door podcast and find out more work by our great researchers, historians, and academics. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us next year.